welcome to the deep dive. Before we get started, do us a massive favor and hit that like button.
Yeah, please do.
And subscribe to the channel right now. It really helps us keep bringing you these ultra-long, incredibly detailed explorations into the ideas that are, actively shaping our world.
Right. It fuels the deep dive.
Exactly. Okay, let's just jump straight into today's mission. We are embarking on an extensive, unapologetically incisive review of a highly provocative new ebook.
Oh, it is definitely making massive waves across the internet right now.
It really is. It's called Feminine Reality Crisis, Raging Against Men and Cutting Off the Patriarchal Branch of the World Tree.
By Conrad Riker?
Yes, Conrad Riker. And we specifically tailored this deep dive for you, the listener. We know you have a strong foundational interest in the modern manosphere, men's rights activism, and really understanding the deep history of our institutions.
Specifically before they were captured.
Right, before they were captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies. Riker's book dives headfirst into all of that. He basically attempts to unpack the exact architecture of how we got here.
He's analyzing the cultural, the biological, and the legal shifts that just completely redefined Western civilization.
I mean, it's a dense read, so if you find the concepts we are exploring today fascinating, and trust me, you absolutely will, you should immediately check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy this ebook.
Highly recommend having the source text.
For sure. You can also follow the author directly at Conrad Riker on Substack.
But before we unpack a single page of this text, we really need to establish some very firm ground rules for today's discussion.
Definitely. This is a charged topic.
Extremely. This text contains incredibly polarizing, highly charged political and social arguments. Riker is launching a sweeping, systemic critique of feminism, of Marxism, and modern gender dynamics.
And his language isn't exactly gentle.
No, not at all. He utilizes language that is specifically designed to be confrontational. It's absolute. So, let me make this explicitly clear to you right now. We, the hosts, are not taking any sides.
None.
We are neither endorsing nor condemning the author's viewpoints. Our sole mission today is to act as impartial guides. We're here to unpack the concepts, the logic, and the claims contained entirely within the original source material.
Just laying it all out on the table.
Exactly. Our goal is simply to help you thoroughly understand Riker's arguments piece by piece so you can evaluate the architecture of his claims for yourself.
We are just the messengers mapping out the territory. And looking at the sheer density of Riker's text, what a massive territory it is.
It is massive.
Our mission today is to explore his foundational concept of what he terms the pink matrix. Then we'll break down his mathematics regarding the modern dating market, trace his historical timeline of institutional capture, and finally lay out his specific actionable roadmap for men looking to reclaim what he calls the logos.
Which is a huge philosophical undertaking in itself.
Right, so to start, Riker opens the book by asserting that modern men are living in a gynocentric simulation. He builds this idea of a reality distortion field permeating our culture.
Where male competence is automatically, reflexively framed as toxic.
Right, while female failure or miscalculation is perpetually framed as systemic victimhood. Under this framework, he says men are treated simply as utility animals.
That's a brutal phrase.
It is. How does he actually define that term within the context of the matrix he's describing?
Well, the term utility animals operates as the foundational lens for his entire thesis. Riker's argument is that modern society views men essentially as biological draft horses.
Just beasts of burden.
Exactly. He claims that men are routinely stripped of their inherent humanity and valued solely for their utility, meaning their physical ability to labor, to produce taxable wealth, and to protect the broader society.
And he brings in some heavy statistics to back that up, right?
He does. To substantiate this claim, he directs the reader's attention to what he calls the death gap. Now, we constantly hear mainstream discourse centered around the wage gap.
Right. It's everywhere in the media.
But Riker argues that focusing on wages while deliberately ignoring mortality is a societal sleight of hand. He pulls U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics data from 2020 to build his case.
And what does that data show?
According to his reading of that data, men suffer 93% of all workplace fatalities.
93%?
Yes, they make up 97% of combat deaths. He also highlights that men account for nearly 80% of all suicides.
Those are staggering numbers.
And his overarching point is that society maintains a deafening, deliberate silence regarding these statistics, because recognizing them would fundamentally shatter the prevailing narrative of systemic male privilege.
Because you can't be the privileged class if you're the one dying to keep the lights on.
That is exactly his logic.
And I noticed he actually grounds this societal indifference in psychological research. He cites a specific study regarding an empathy gap, doesn't he?
He does. He points to a University of Pennsylvania study regarding the cognitive empathy gap between how we perceive men and women. The study suggests that human beings, regardless of their own gender, literally perceive men as feeling less physical and emotional pain than women do in the exact same scenarios.
So if a man and a woman get the same injury, our brains literally trick us into thinking the man hurts less?
Yes. Riker uses this clinical data to argue that the cultural indifference to male suffering isn't just a political choice. He says it's a conditioned, almost biological blind spot that the current system actively exploits.
Because the system requires male utility.
Right. It requires the utility, so it conditions the populace to be entirely blind to the cost of extracting that utility.
I love how he doesn't just present this data and move on. He takes these statistics and runs them through a very rigid classical logic structure.
The Aristotelian syllogism of oppression.
Yes. Given that our audience really appreciates rigorous frameworks, walk me through how he constructs this philosophical argument.
Well, Riker relies heavily on formal logic, specifically drawing from Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas as a rhetorical weapon to dismantle modern sociological theories.
Okay, so a standard syllogism requires a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion.
Right. For his syllogism of oppression, the major premise is defined like this. An oppressive ruling class will naturally, historically, and invariably create societal systems designed to maximize its own safety, its own physical comfort, and its own longevity.
Usually at the expense of a subjugated class.
Exactly.
Which makes total historical sense. If you look at the aristocracies of Europe or feudal lords, they weren't the ones dying in the coal mines or on the front lines. They exported the physical risk to the peasantry.
Precisely his point. That leads directly to his minor premise. Men, as a demographic class, constitute the vast, overwhelming majority of workplace fatalities, combat deaths, and suicides.
The 93% statistic.
Right. They are performing the most dangerous, life-shortening tasks required to keep the power grid running, the bridges standing, and the borders secure. Therefore, he arrives at his conclusion.
Which is?
Men cannot logically be the oppressive ruling class. If they were the ruling class, they would have engineered a society where someone else took on the physical risks. Instead, he argues, men are an expendable caste supporting a gynocentric hegemony.
So he's saying if men were truly the privileged class of a patriarchy, society would treat this epidemic of male pain, workplace death, and suicide as a massive five-alarm national crisis.
Yes, rather than simply writing it off as an acceptable operating cost for civilization.
He grounds this deeply ingrained expectation of male sacrifice in a historical analogy he calls the Titanic protocol.
The women and children first rule.
Exactly. We are all familiar with that phrase from maritime disasters, but Riker argues this was never about chivalry or gentlemanly honor.
He frames it as the explicit foundational source code of our societal operating system.
Right. He argues that male existence is quite literally the sacrifice currency that is spent to purchase female security. And what's really compelling about his angle here is how he contrasts it with modern feminist demands.
He claims that modern intersectional feminism wants to entirely remove the historical burdens and restrictions of traditional female roles,
but simultaneously expects men to continue carrying the ultimate fatal burden of provision and physical protection.
And on top of that, men are instructed to apologize for their supposed privilege while they're drowning.
It's a brutal metaphor. But the Titanic protocol serves as his bridge from cultural observation straight into hard biology.
Because Riker is vehemently, fundamentally opposed to the prevailing academic consensus that gender is merely a social construct.
He really goes after the blank slate theory here. To illustrate the danger of ignoring biology, he draws a stark historical parallel to Lysenkoism.
That's a fascinating historical pull. For the listener unfamiliar with that term, Trofim Lysenko was a Soviet agronomist under Joseph Stalin.
Right, and Lysenko rejected the hard science of genetics.
Specifically Mendelian inheritance, because the idea of immutable inherited traits conflicted with Marxist ideology. Marxism insisted that any organism could be perfectly molded by its environment.
So Lysenko actually claimed that crops could be trained to grow in the freezing Russian winter simply by exposing the seeds to cold.
Yes, and the Soviet state enforced this pseudoscience. They outlawed actual genetics, and the result was massive, catastrophic agricultural failure and famine. millions starved.
And Riker maps that exact historical disaster onto modern gender theory.
He maps it perfectly. Riker argues that modern academics and cultural institutions are committing the exact same fatal error as the Soviets. They are willfully denying the hard, observable science of human biology and evolutionary psychology simply to maintain strict ideological purity.
So he asserts that gender roles are not arbitrary cultural inventions concocted by men to oppress women.
No, he says they are ironclad biological imperatives forged over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution.
He gets highly specific regarding the chemical drivers of this biology, too. He spends a significant portion of the text contrasting testosterone and estrogen.
He doesn't just view them as hormones that change your physical appearance. He frames them as completely different operating systems for the human brain.
Right. According to Riker's reading of endocrinology, testosterone is the essential fuel of systematization.
It is the chemical driver of logic, spatial reasoning, risk-taking, and the literal physical construction of civilization.
He refers to this masculine drive as the logos.
Yes. And on the other side of the ledger, he argues that estrogen biologically predisposes women toward empathy, egalitarianism, and social networking.
Now, he acknowledges that estrogen-driven behavior is vital for early tribal cohesion and infant rearing.
He does, but he believes it is inherently catastrophic for objective leadership or maintaining the cold, hard infrastructure of a modern nation-state.
If we look closely at how he structures this, he is arguing that modern society has committed a profound error by taking necessary survival-oriented masculine traits like aggression, extreme competitiveness, emotional stoicism, the willingness to engage in conflict, and pathologizing them as toxic.
He asserts that civilization itself is an inherently masculine construct, built purely on the back of testosterone-driven ambition.
To further cement this biological framework, he brings in Bateman's principle from evolutionary psychology. Given our audience's familiarity with evolutionary concepts, how does Riker specifically apply Bateman's principle to his critique of the modern social order?
While the audience may know the basics of hypergamy, Riker uses Bateman's principle to explain the fundamental, inescapable asymmetry of the sexual marketplace.
Right, breaking it down to the cellular level.
Exactly. In biology, Bateman's principle observes that in most species, females are the limiting reproductive factor. Eggs are biologically expensive. Pregnancies are incredibly taxing. And human infants require years of intensive vulnerability.
Conversely, sperm is cheap, abundant, and requires essentially zero biological investment post-conception.
Because females are the absolute biological gatekeepers of reproduction, Riker argues male and female reproductive strategies cannot ever be equal or identical. They are fundamentally divergent.
He uses the analogy of a silverback gorilla troop to illustrate this, doesn't he? Arguing that rigid hierarchy and male dominance are not social constructs, but the default state of nature designed to optimize genetic survival.
Yes. Riker claims that modern feminism attempts an impossible balancing act. It seeks to unleash unrestrained female-based instincts, specifically hypergamy, which is the biological desire to mate upward in status, wealth, and physical dominance,
while simultaneously demanding the safety, the infrastructure, and the resource sharing that can only be created by a rigid, disciplined male hierarchy.
He argues that feminism demands the rights, freedoms, and choices of the conqueror, but actively refuses the responsibilities and sacrifices of the protector.
Which brings us to a concept our listeners are definitely familiar with, the nice guy paradox.
Oh, yes.
We all know the standard manosphere critique of the guy who does everything right but finishes last. But Riker takes a totally different angle here. He doesn't just mock the nice guy. He applies formal game theory to the dynamic. Walk me through his concept of obsolete firmware.
This is one of his sharpest analogies. Riker posits that the nice guy isn't a villain or even a coward. Rather, he's a tragic victim of asynchronous societal programming.
The nice guy is operating on obsolete firmware.
Right. He was programmed by his mother, his teachers, and the media to abide by the old traditional social contract. Be a good, stable provider, suppress your aggression, treat women with deference, and the system will reward you with lifelong loyalty and a stable family.
But Riker argues that the old contract has been unilaterally shredded.
Completely. When you apply game theory to the modern, unregulated sexual marketplace, the environment no longer rewards the stable provider. Instead, it biologically rewards dark triad traits.
Meaning narcissism, Machiavellianism, and subclinical psychopathy.
Yes.
Because in a chaotic, ruleless environment, those aggressive traits falsely signal high genetic fitness to female biology.
That is precisely his argument. In the absence of a patriarchy that enforced monogamy and pair bonding, Female biology defaults to seeking raw dominance.
So the nice guy fails entirely because he's playing by the rules of a cooperative game that Riker says was rigged against him and dismantled before he was even born.
He is playing chess while the modern dating market is a bare-knuckle brawl.
So if the firmware was updated, or rather corrupted, to create this chaotic environment, how exactly did that happen? Who dismantled the old social contract?
Riker doesn't just leave this as an abstract cultural shift. He provides a meticulous historical timeline.
He traces the philosophical roots of this societal upheaval directly back to the Institute. He's deeply interested in the history of institutional capture. How does Riker map the strategy of thinkers like Antonio Gramsci and Herbert Marcuse?
To understand Riker's historical tracking, we have to look at the massive strategic pivot Marxism took in the early to mid-20th century.
Classical Marxism relied on the idea of a violent workers' revolution.
The theory was that the proletariat would become so impoverished and oppressed by capitalism that they would violently seize the means of production. But as thinkers like Antonio Gramsci observed, this simply wasn't happening in the West.
Right. The Western working class was becoming too prosperous, too comfortable, and too invested in the capital system to revolt. They were buying cars, owning homes, raising families.
So the violent physical revolution failed, forcing a complete change in tactics. Gramsci realized that a violent overthrow was mathematically impossible in a prosperous capitalist society protected by a strong, satisfied middle class.
So the Marxist strategy shifted entirely from economic warfare to cultural warfare.
Exactly. They focused on capturing the cultural hegemony, meaning the media, the church, the legal system, and most importantly, the educational institutions.
This is the famous long march through the institutions.
Riker argues that these critical theorists identify the nuclear family, traditional gender roles, and the concept of a strong patriarchal father figure as the ultimate bourgeois obstacles to their utopian vision.
Because you cannot make citizens entirely dependent on the state if they have a strong, self-sufficient family unit.
Precisely. So, according to Riker, they didn't invade with tanks and rifles. They invaded with tenure tracks and sociology degrees.
They slowly, methodically transformed universities from places of rigorous, objective logic into what Riker bluntly labels ideological re-education camps.
He backs up this claim of institutional capture by pointing to the modern education gap. Riker highlights a staggering statistic. Women now make up roughly 60% of university enrollment across many Western nations.
And in some specific disciplines, that number is even higher. His argument here is quite sharp. He notes that if the university system were truly the oppressive, patriarchal construct that feminist theory claims it is, this 60% statistic would be mathematically and structurally impossible.
Instead, he asserts that the educational system has been deliberately, systematically stripped of rigorous, competitive masculine logic.
He claims it has been replaced with a feminized framework of continuous assessment, group work, and emotional compliance that actively penalizes the natural male learning style.
He goes so far as to argue that young boys are routinely medicated with amphetamines simply for acting like energetic, disruptive young boys in an environment designed by and for female sensibilities.
The culmination of this educational capture is what we now call woke ideology, which Riker analyzes not just as a political movement, but as a profound psychological pathology.
He examines this through the lens of the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, specifically utilizing Nietzsche's concept of resentiment.
For our listeners who might not be deep into Nietzschean philosophy, how does Riker define resentiment and map it onto modern HR departments and university administrations?
Resentiment is a complex concept. It refers to a reactive, impotent form of slave morality.
Slave morality.
Yes. It is the deep-seated psychological state where an individual or a group who feels inherently inferior, powerless, or unaccomplished seeks to tear down the superior out of venomous envy, rather than doing the hard work of elevating themselves.
They reframe their own weakness as a moral virtue.
And they reframe the strength and competence of their enemies as an inherent evil. Riker argues that the modern social justice movement and the HR bureaucracies that enforce it are entirely driven by this resentment.
He claims they possess no desire to build anything new or functional. Their singular objective is to destroy masculine competence and meritocracy because the existence of objective excellence highlights their own inadequacies.
He points to the modern demand for safe spaces on college campuses as the ultimate manifestation of this.
Right. He frames it as a supreme, almost comical irony. He notes that these groups demand a sanitized space completely free from intellectual or emotional discomfort.
Yet they rely entirely on the physical infrastructure, the massive electrical grids, the HVAC systems, the concrete buildings, the armed security forces that was built, maintained, and operated almost exclusively by the very masculine archetype they claim to despise.
They demand a luxury constructed by the patriarchy in order to safely critique the patriarchy.
Exactly.
He defines this entire cultural shift as the ultimate war on logos. For Riker, the logos isn't just a word. It represents divine reason, objective truth, and the structural foundation of Western civilization itself.
He argues that the modern institutional system deliberately elevates subjective, internal feelings over objective empirical facts.
It is an organized attempt to dissolve shared reality into solipsistic emotion. Under this new paradigm, if a woman or a marginalized group says they feel unsafe, the system is programmed to treat that subjective feeling as an objective, actionable reality.
Completely overriding any empirical data, statistical probability, or standard of due process.
So, if the culture has been captured by this woke resentment and reality is being overwritten by subjective emotion, how does that actually play out in day-to-day human interaction?
Because Riker takes this massive theoretical framework and applies it directly to something highly practical and relevant to the listener, the mathematics of modern dating apps.
Yes, this is where he brings in data to quantify the cultural distortion. He relies heavily on a controversial, albeit widely cited, internal study from the dating site Ocupid.
The famous Ocupid data.
According to the data he pulls from this study, women on the platform rated a staggering 80% of all men as below average in physical attractiveness.
Now, wait a minute. From a purely statistical standpoint, rating 80% of a population is below average completely breaks the mathematical concept of a bell curve.
It breaks it entirely. How does he square that data?
He doesn't square it. He uses that exact mathematical impossibility to prove his central point about digital delusion. In a normal distribution, most people cluster around the average. But Riker argues that digital platforms and social media have hyperinflated female expectations to a point of literal mathematical absurdity.
He takes the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, which often applies in economics where 80% of the wealth is held by 20% of the people, and applies it directly to the sexual marketplace.
Because dating apps give average women the illusion of infinite global choice, it completely devalues the attention of the average functional man.
He calls this the top 5% delusion.
Exactly his phrasing. He claims that average women now universally demand a man in the top elite percentile. The colloquial 6 feet tall, 6 figures, 6-pack archetype.
By definition, that mathematically condemns 95% of the male population to involuntary singlehood, because those top-tier men simply do not exist in the sheer numbers required to meet the artificially inflated demand.
The math does not and cannot work.
He blames this statistical delusion on psychological conditioning, specifically pointing to what he calls the Disney princess disease and the modern phenomenon of main character syndrome.
Riker argues that decades of media conditioning, advertising, and cultural pandering have created a profound, systemic narcissism in the modern female psyche.
Women are essentially taught from early childhood that they are the unquestionable protagonists of the universe.
In this solipsistic mindset, men are reduced to NPCs, non-playable characters, whose only viable purpose is to advance her personal plotline, provide her with resources, or offer her validation.
He says this creates a deeply toxic dynamic where women demand all the historical rewards of traditional femininity, being fiercely provided for, being physically protected, being cherished.
Without offering any of the traditional reciprocal responsibilities, such as domestic utility, loyalty, or submission.
If we take that behavioral analysis a step further, it raises a critical question about the timeline and the eventual consequences of this behavior. A woman might be able to demand top-tier attention in her 20s, but Riker introduces the concept of the wall.
Now, the audience is familiar with the idea of the wall, but Riker's application is strictly tied to the biological depreciation of assets.
He posits that female fertility and biological market value are depreciating assets that peak around age 22 and crash dramatically, almost vertically, by age 35.
He argues that modern feminist careerism actively gaslights women into dedicating their peak fertility years, their most valuable biological currency, to serving a corporate bureaucracy.
Serving the very system that Gramsci and the critical theorists wanted them to rely on.
Precisely. By the time these women hit the wall in their mid-30s and realize they actually desire a family in a traditional structure, Their biological market value has plummeted
Simultaneously, the very men they ignored, mocked, or swiped left on in their 20s have now reached the peak of their earning power, status, and competence.
and are naturally seeking younger, more fertile women.
And the result of hitting that wall without securing a partner? Riker doesn't mince words here. He calls it the cat lady pipeline.
He argues that when these women finally realize they've priced themselves out of the market and miss their biological window, they engage in a spiteful mutation strategy.
Instead of reflecting on their choices or lowering their impossible standards, they double down on their independence.
They become increasingly hostile toward men, ultimately leaving themselves entirely isolated. They attempt to substitute pets for children, replacing the complexities and compromises of a human family unit with an animal that demands nothing but food and offers uncritical affection.
But Riker argues that this entire demographic shift, the delayed marriages, the collapse of fertility, the hostility between the sexes, isn't merely a cultural or psychological phenomenon.
He asserts it is chemically engineered.
This moves us out of sociology and into his arguments regarding chemical warfare and what he provocatively terms the endocrine holocaust.
This is undeniably one of his most controversial yet fiercely argued biological claims.
Riker asserts that the widespread use of hormonal birth control is not a triumph of women's liberation, but is literally a form of chemical sabotage deployed against the human pair bond.
I want to spend some time here because he doesn't just make a baseless claim. He points to specific scientific literature.
Right. He heavily references a 1995 study by a Swiss biological researcher named Klaus Wedekind. Let's really unpack the science he's claiming here because it revolves around something called the major histocompatibility complex, or MHC.
The mechanism driving that, according to Riker's reading of the science, is evolutionary biology at its most primal. The MHC is a set of genes that code for proteins found on the surfaces of cells that help the immune system recognize foreign substances.
The Wedekind study, often referred to as the sweaty t-shirt study, suggests that naturally cycling, ovulating women are biologically hardwired to seek out the scent of men who possess MHC genes that are wildly genetically dissimilar to their own.
And the evolutionary reason for that is to ensure that their offspring have a strong, highly diverse immune system, preventing recessive genetic mutations.
For 300,000 years of human evolution, this olfactory mechanism ensured genetic diversity and strength. However, Riker points out that the introduction of the hormonal birth control pill completely disrupted this ancient mechanism.
The pill works by flooding the female body with synthetic estrogen and progestin, effectively tricking the woman's endocrine system into a state of simulated permanent pregnancy.
And when her body believes it's pregnant, her genetic preferences completely flip.
They invert entirely. According to Riker's interpretation of the data, a woman on the pill suddenly prefers the scent of men with genetically similar immune systems.
Because in nature, a pregnant woman seeks the safety and proximity of her genetic relatives, her tribe, her family.
Riker argues that the pill chemically induces a preference for compliant, familiar, lower testosterone beta males who feel like safe family members.
Rather than the genetically dissimilar dominant alpha males she would naturally be drawn to for reproduction.
The downstream effects of this, in his view, are absolutely catastrophic for marriage. A woman meets a safe, compliant, similar guy while she's heavily medicated on the pill. They date, they get married.
But then, say, 5 years later, they decide it's time to start a family.
She goes off the pill to conceive. The synthetic hormones clear her system, her natural, unsuppressed biology kicks back into gear, and suddenly, on a deeply primal olfactory level, she is biologically repulsed by the husband she chose.
Riker claims this chemical bait and switch is the hidden, unacknowledged engine driving a massive percentage of the modern divorce rate initiated by women. He literally frames the pill as an endocrine weapon deployed against the stability of the nuclear family.
And he extends this argument of biological disruption to what he calls surgical self-sabotage.
He looks at the modern child-free movement and the rising trend of young, healthy women actively seeking elective tubal ligations or relying on long-term, semi-permanent IUDs.
Riker frames this not as a victory for bodily autonomy, but as voluntary, ideologically driven eugenics. He labels it an idiocracy reversal.
He argues that the most highly educated, highest IQ, most capable women in Western society are voluntarily self-sterilizing due to media-induced climate anxiety or academic misandry.
By refusing to reproduce, they are essentially ensuring their own genetic and ideological extinction, while demographics that completely ignore these modern progressive theories continue to reproduce at replacement rates.
He zooms out to look at the macroeconomics of this, diagnosing it as demographic suicide. He points to Sweden as his primary case study, and the data he uses is grim.
Sweden has essentially offered the ultimate feminist utopian dream. Massive state subsidies for mothers, extensive paid family leave, universal subsidized childcare, and a cultural commitment to gender equality.
And yet, despite all of these incentives, Riker points out that Sweden's total fertility rate is sitting around 1.6, which is drastically below the 2.1 replacement level necessary simply to sustain a population without relying entirely on mass immigration.
He uses this Nordic failure to argue that the entire Western welfare state is mathematically guaranteed to collapse. He compares it to a generational Ponzi scheme.
It absolutely requires a constantly expanding massive base of young, productive taxpayers to fund the astronomical pension and healthcare costs of the elderly.
If the women of a society refuse to have children, the tax base inevitably collapses and the entire welfare system goes bankrupt.
Which logically forces the question, if the biological pair bond is chemically severed and the societal structure is facing demographic collapse, how does the system sustain itself in the interim?
Riker argues that the legal system has been deliberately re-engineered to extract the remaining resources from men during the fall.
This brings us to his intense focus on the divorce industrial complex.
According to Riker, the introduction of no-fault divorce in the late 20th century fundamentally destroyed the legal concept of the marriage contract.
He argues forcefully that marriage is now the only binding contract in Western jurisprudence where one party can unilaterally breach the terms of the agreement for absolutely no reason, and the power of the state will actively penalize the party who kept their end of the bargain.
He views the mechanisms of alimony, lifetime spousal support, and disproportionate asset division as a state-sanctioned, legalized transfer of wealth from male producers to female consumers.
A lot of guys listening to this right now might think, well, that's what legal protection is for. I'll just get an ironclad prenuptial agreement.
But Riker anticipates that counter-argument. He calls this the prenup illusion.
He claims that family court judges, operating within a gynocentric legal framework, routinely invalidate or throw out prenuptial agreements under vague claims of duress or unconscionability just to ensure that male wealth is successfully extracted and redistributed.
Furthermore, he points out a massive glaring legal hypocrisy regarding reproductive rights, which he terms the paper abortion double standard.
This is a critical pillar of his legal argument, highlighting the asymmetry of power.
Riker notes that the moment a pregnancy occurs, the woman holds absolute, unilateral, and unquestionable legal power over the outcome of that birth. She has the right to choose to abort, to put the child up for adoption, or to keep the child, regardless of the man's wishes.
The man, however, is stripped of all reproductive agency. If he desires to keep the child and she does not, he has zero legal recourse to stop an abortion.
Conversely, if he does not want the child and she decides to carry it to term, he is held strictly legally liable for 2 decades of financial child support.
Riker even points to the harrowing reality of paternity fraud, citing cases where men are forced by the courts to continue paying child support for children that DNA tests conclusively prove are not biologically theirs.
Simply because the state prioritizes the uninterrupted financial subsidization of the mother over the biological truth and financial freedom of the father.
It is, in his framing, a system of pure, unadulterated extraction. He backs this up with aggressive tax data, outlining what he calls the parasitic ledger.
Riker asserts that men, due to working longer hours in higher-paying, higher-risk fields, pay roughly 70 to 80% of all total consumer and income taxes collected by the state.
Meanwhile, women, as a demographic, consume the vast, overwhelming majority of state welfare resources, healthcare spending, subsidies, and administrative jobs. He says men are effectively treated as a tax farm, harvested for their labor.
If we synthesize Riker's conclusion on the economics of this arrangement, it's that the welfare state itself has literally replaced the husband.
In the traditional historical model, a woman relied on an individual man for provision, resources, and physical protection, which fundamentally required reciprocity, loyalty, and cooperation.
Today, Riker argues, the state extracts resources from men at large via the implicit threat of violence, meaning taxation, backed by the armed enforcement of the IRS or the police, and seamlessly redistributes those resources to women.
This systemic extraction completely removes any requirement for female gratitude, loyalty, or reciprocity toward individual men.
The state acts as the ultimate enforcer, ensuring the wealth transfer happens automatically, whether the individual man consents to it or not.
So how does a system justify treating half its population as an expendable tax farm? This requires a massive rhetorical smokescreen.
This is where Riker's language gets incredibly incendiary. He makes a direct, unflinching comparison between modern feminist rhetoric and historical totalitarian scapegoating.
He calls the overarching cultural narrative the Men Kampf Protocol.
We must be clear here about the gravity of his claim. Riker is arguing that modern patriarchy theory operates structurally, psychologically, and rhetorically, just like a totalitarian conspiracy theory.
Totalitarian regimes always require a scapegoat to unify the masses.
He claims that feminism blames men, as a collective demographic group, for absolutely all societal ills, war, poverty, crime, inequality, environmental degradation, in order to justify the seizure of cultural power, the removal of due process for men, and the expropriation of male assets.
He argues that ubiquitous terms like toxic masculinity or mansplaining aren't genuine critiques of bad behavior. They are deliberate, calculated attempts to pathologize the very traits like aggression, stoicism, and analytical debate that are fundamentally required to build, maintain, and defend civilization.
He ties this rhetorical weaponization back to academia, specifically critiquing a concept called standpoint epistemology.
Let's spend some time defining this, because it's the academic engine driving the cultural madness he describes. Standpoint epistemology is the idea that a person's lived experience, particularly the experience of someone belonging to a marginalized group, is a valid, unquestionable form of knowledge, sometimes even superseding objective empirical data.
Riker absolutely eviscerates this concept. He identifies standpoint epistemology as the intellectual academic justification for rampant female solipsism.
As we briefly touched on earlier, solipsism is the philosophical idea that only one's own mind is sure to exist.
Riker claims modern women are relentlessly conditioned by the culture to be solipsistic, utterly unable to conceive of a world where they are not the main character, and unable to empathize with the struggles of men.
When you combine this ingrained solipsism with standpoint epistemology, Riker argues, subjective feelings are allowed to completely override empirical data and the scientific method.
If a woman feels threatened, her internal subjective feeling is treated as an objective, actionable reality by the university administration, the courts, and the culture, regardless of whether any actual threat exists.
He asserts that by adopting this framework, society is voluntarily abandoning 3,000 years of Western epistemological tradition based on Aristotelian logic, evidence, and the presumption of innocence.
To illustrate how terrifyingly fast this subjective reality can be weaponized in the real world, he brings up the Amy Cooper incident in Central Park.
We all remember the viral video. Christian Cooper, an African-American bird watcher, asks Amy Cooper, a white woman, to leash her dog according to the posted park rules.
She immediately pulls out her phone and calls the police, hysterically claiming an African-American man is actively threatening her life.
Riker uses this as the ultimate undeniable proof of the Karen phenomenon. He argues this isn't just a story about racial tensions, it's about the innate weaponization of female discomfort.
Her minor subjective discomfort at being asked to follow the rules was immediately treated by her as a moral emergency, and she instinctively knew she could summon the state's monopoly on violence-armed police officers to enforce her gynocentric privilege against a man who was simply stating objective facts.
Riker then connects this solipsistic main character behavior to the hyper-narcissism of the digital age. He brilliantly applies B.F. Skinner's behavioral psychology to modern social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok.
Skinner, the famous behaviorist, discovered through animal testing that variable ratio reinforcement, meaning an animal gets a reward at unpredictable random intervals, creates the most intensely addictive behavior possible.
Riker argues that social media apps are quite literally digital meats. Skinner boxes, meticulously designed by engineers to exploit the female psyche's need for social validation. Every time she posts a heavily filtered selfie, it's the equivalent of a rat pulling the lever on a slot machine.
Maybe she gets 100 likes and flattering comments, maybe she gets 10. That unpredictable, constant validation loop creates a literal narcissism epidemic.
Riker says it commodifies young women into influencers who value purely cosmetic perception, how things look, the aesthetic of a life over the masculine drive to actually build, endure, and conquer physical reality.
He frames it as a battle between the feminine will to be seen versus the Nietzschean masculine will to power.
Having diagnosed the entirety of modern Western society as a hostile, parasitical matrix designed to extract male utility while punishing male nature, Riker finally shifts to the solution. What is a man to do?
This brings us to the final and perhaps most crucial part of his book, reclaiming the logos and the roadmap to ascension.
After diagnosing the illness, he shifts to highly actionable, almost militaristic advice for his reader. He fiercely advocates for a comprehensive strategy of monastic withdrawal.
He calls it the strategic syllogism of withdrawal. Because the legal, cultural, and economic systems are fundamentally stacked against men, and because the rules are constantly changed to ensure men lose, Riker argues the only logical, mathematically sound move is to simply refuse to play their game.
He gives very specific instructions. Number 1, do not sign marriage contracts. The legal liability and the threat of the family courts are simply too catastrophic to risk.
In the corporate world, he advises men to utilize the gray rock method when dealing with HR departments and corporate culture.
For those unaware, the gray rock method is a psychological technique used to deal with narcissists. You become as uninteresting, unemotional, and unresponsive as a literal gray rock.
Do your job, extract your paycheck, do not share personal opinions, do not engage in office politics, and give them absolutely nothing they can ever use against you.
But physical and legal withdrawal isn't enough. He argues that the modern man is addicted to his own pacification. He argues for profound psychological withdrawal through what he calls monk mode.
This isn't just a weekend detox. It is a rigorous, agonizing 90-day neurological protocol. Riker instructs men to ruthlessly purge all pornography, all video games, and all junk media from their lives.
Why? Because he argues these are digital pacifiers engineered by the system to keep men docile. Pornography artificially simulates reproductive success, draining a man's biological drive to pursue real women.
Video games artificially simulate conquest, mastery, and heroism, draining a man's drive to conquer reality.
By completely removing these artificial, unearned dopamine hits, a man forces his brain to reset its neurochemistry. This biological reset forces him to seek satisfaction and dopamine in the friction of building real-world value, rather than settling for the cheap comfort of digital simulations.
And once that neurochemistry is reset, what are they supposed to build? Riker doesn't want men to just hide in the woods. He wants them to build parallel institutions.
He envisions what he grandly calls the new manosphere Jerusalem. He urges men to completely and permanently abandon the traditional corporate ladder, which he says is heavily guarded by woke HR commissars and diversity mandates that actively block male advancement.
Instead, he tells men to embrace the global gig economy, freelance work, and entrepreneurship as a new guild system.
And financially, he is a massive, unapologetic proponent of Bitcoin and decentralized finance. He sees cryptocurrency not just as an investment, but as a technological weapon.
It is an immutable, math-based ledger that the parasitic ledger of the state, the IRS, and the family courts fundamentally cannot touch, freeze, or confiscate.
This drive for total financial independence culminates in calculating what he bluntly calls the FU number. This requires a strategy of radical, almost painful frugality.
Riker advises men to calculate exactly 25 times their annual baseline expenses to achieve total liquidity and permanent financial independence.
The logic here is brilliant in its simplicity. Once a man hits that specific number, the implicit threats of the corporate matrix, the threat of being fired, the threat of being culturally canceled, the threat of starvation, become entirely null and void.
He cannot be controlled, coerced, or intimidated by the hegemony because he does not rely on their system for his survival. He has achieved true autonomy.
And finally, for the men who do choose to have families, who refuse to let their bloodline end, despite the hostile environment, he lays out the difficult path of the red pill father.
Riker views the modern public school system as nothing more than a state-sponsored indoctrination camp, explicitly designed to psychologically castrate boys and radicalize young girls into the matrix.
His solution is drastic: remove children from the system entirely. He calls for the establishment of private homeschooling co-ops, which he compares to the ancient classical scholae.
In these controlled environments, boys are to be taught classical stoicism, rigorous physical strength training, and the trivium, the classical education model of grammar, formal logic, and rhetoric.
By teaching young boys formal Aristotelian logic, Riker argues, you give them the impenetrable intellectual armor necessary to dismantle the emotional, solipsistic arguments of cultural Marxism they will inevitably encounter.
He asserts that the man who understands logic, who controls his own assets, and who builds undeniable real-world value is the deep, immovable root of the world tree.
By fiercely protecting those roots, educating their sons, and separating their labor from the decaying system, Riker believes men can simply wait out the inevitable mathematical collapse of the gynocentric order and emerge from the ruins to build a new logocentric civilization.
It is an incredibly dense, intense, and demanding blueprint for survival and rebuilding.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've covered a massive amount of conceptual ground today, digging deep into the pink matrix, the horrifying statistics of the death gap, the biological disruption of the endocrine holocaust, and the strategic roadmap for monastic withdrawal.
We've traced the history from Gramsci to modern dating apps.
As we conclude this extensive deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over a philosophical thread that builds on Riker's core premise but extends it into the rapidly approaching near future.
Riker forcefully argues that all of civilization's physical infrastructure, its technological progress, and its systems of logic are strictly tied to a specific masculine logos. He claims that men, fueled by testosterone, are the ultimate builders and systematizers of reality.
But if we look at the breathtaking exponential advancement of artificial intelligence, we are seeing the creation of machines that are beginning to automate the very analytical, systematizing, and logical tasks that Riker attributes purely to the male biological drive.
If AI can soon write flawless code, solve complex engineering and physics problems, and manage global logistics with perfect, cold Aristotelian logic, completely devoid of human emotion, bias, or fatigue.
What happens to the masculine role? Will the future logocentric civilization that Riker envisions actually be built and maintained by biological men? Or will it be inherited and run entirely by the whole calculating, immortal machines that men designed?
It's a profound question of whether the logos ultimately transcends human biology altogether.
That is a staggering, slightly terrifying thought to end on. If the machines take over the logos, where does that leave the men who built them? I want to genuinely thank you, the listener, for joining us on this intense, incredibly deep dive into the source material today. We covered some highly controversial, intellectually rigorous ground, and we appreciate you staying with us to unpack the architecture of these arguments.
Please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a deep dive like this.
And a final reminder, if you found this exploration into the history of our institutions and the manosphere roadmap fascinating, you absolutely need to read the source text for yourself. Head over to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy Conrad Riker's Feminine Reality Crisis, Raging Against Men. And absolutely do not forget to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for more of his writings. Keep questioning the narrative, keep building your independence, and we will see you on the next deep dive.